Hi, everyone, and welcome to the California Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Jen Fields, and I'm the facilitator for the Coastal Resilience Network, as well as the Climate Ready Sea Grant State Fellow for the State Coastal Conservancy. The California Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. We will provide a link to the webinar if you would like to join and watch past webinars, including today's on our website. These links can be found on the follow-up email you will receive after today's webinar. Today's presentation will provide an overview of the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, or BCDC's Bay Plan Climate Change Policy Guidance, including some findings from the drafting process and example case studies that are useful and relevant to adaptation practitioners across the state of California and beyond. Today, we welcome our panelists from BCDC, Dan Hossfeld. Dan joined the Adapt for Rising Tides team at BCDC in 2020 as an environmental scientist. He holds a bachelor's in science and environmental science and management from UC Davis and a master's in science in marine science from San Francisco State University. He is also the previous Sea Grant State Fellow in my position with the State Coastal Conservancy in the Climate Ready program, where he oversaw grant making for living shoreline and managed retreat projects. In addition, Dana Brechwald will be joining us for the webinar during the Q&A session. She is the Adapt for Rising Tides program manager at BCDC. To go into webinar logistics, we will listen and watch the presentation for about 40 minutes and follow up with a Q&A session. During the presentation, feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function on the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen. And there is also closed captioning available for the webinar in the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And with that, I will be managing the Q&A, and Dana and Dan will respond. This webinar will be recorded and available for review after the webinar. And with that, I will pass off the virtual mic to Dan.
Cool. Thank you, Jen. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be back with the Coastal Resilience Network. As Jen mentioned, I'm a member of the Adapting to Rising Tides program that's housed within BCDC, where I work as an environmental scientist specializing in climate-related impacts to the Bay. And today, I'm going to share some of the basics about our recently adopted Bay Plan Climate Change Policy Guidance, which is now available on our website and is being introduced to BCDC's partners. Obviously, lots of the content is directed towards BCDC's permittees, but I made sure to tailor today's presentation to a wider audience, since I know there are folks from around the state and maybe beyond who might benefit from checking out this new resource for some model policies, permit and special condition example language, case studies, and accessible scientific summaries that all relate back to implementing sea level rise adaptation projects in general. And I hope I'll be kind of quick about it so that we can get into questions and maybe end a little early. So I'll jump right in. So BCDC is a state agency, but works regionally within the San Francisco Bay. BCDC was established in 1965 as the first coastal management agency in the United States, and along with the Coastal Commission and the Coastal Conservancy, makes up the California Coastal Zone Management Program. So BCDC regulates generally the San Francisco Bay, a 100-foot shoreline band around the bay, and the Suisun Marsh. And within the shoreline band, BCDC is also responsible for managing and maximizing public access to the bay. So BCDC was created due to a serious threat to the bay at the time, which was the fill of the bay. And starting in the 1800s, the bay was being filled more to create more land, to build on the land. BCDC was established to stop fill, and mostly in the bay, and to preserve and protect it along with its natural resources as a public good. So these maps are fun to start off with. They show what could have been the future of the bay, and also some of the rapid changes we're seeing today. So by 1965, when BCDC was established, you can see the white parts of the map, the 1965 map there, are areas of the bay that were already filled. So the prediction map for 2020, if you look at growth without protections from BCDC related to stopping fill, the San Francisco Bay was anticipated to have been reduced to a river. Today, however, the Bay Area faces sea level rise. And so instead of the bay getting smaller, rising water is reshaping the bay in a different way and potentially towards the 2100 projection map there without intervention. So as I mentioned, I'm part of the Adapting to Rising Tides program within BCDC. This program was created to help the region understand the risks of sea level rise and flooding, and to support local jurisdictions in their efforts to address these challenges. And over the last decade, the program has developed how-to guides for vulnerability assessments, for adaptation planning processes. It has partnered with local, state, and federal agencies on leading various similar projects. And it has provided data and maps on flooding, conducted research on sea level rise and flooding topics in general. So on to the policies, the climate policies in the Bay Plan and the new guidance about those policies. So for today's presentation, I'll start with some background information on the climate change policies. I'll discuss the need for and the planned use of this new guidance and outline how we developed this new guidance, followed by providing an overview of the content and how that content could be used by practitioners within or beyond BCDC's jurisdiction. So moving into background of the Bay Plan climate change policies, as we touched on, there's the McAteer-Petras Act, which was enacted in 1965, which allowed for the development of the San Francisco Bay Plan, which provides the basis for BCDC's regulations. And in 2011, the Commission approved the Bay Plan Amendment to address climate change. This amendment added a new section to the Bay Plan entitled Climate Change, and that included the 8 policies that we'll be discussing. But it also revised other sections on tidal marshes and tidal flats, safety of fills, shoreline protection, public access, and some others to incorporate findings and policies that would help permittees better address the threats of sea level rise to their shoreline and bay projects. So I'll provide a summary of each of the main climate policies, but they're also obviously found with more in-depth discussion in the guidance itself. Policy number 1, basically jurisdiction. It frames how the following policies should be used by the Commission by stipulating how the Commission's existing jurisdictions relate to the new policies and where they could be applied. And generally, this jurisdiction includes San Francisco Bay, that 100-foot shoreline band, salt ponds, managed wetlands, certain waterways, and the Sassoon Marsh, all of which are, described in the government code. So policy 2 is kind of where we get into some of the differences that in some of the interesting policies that BCDC was able to enact. So this policy requires that larger shoreline projects must complete a risk assessment regarding sea level rise and potential future flooding. And it stipulates what information should be included in that risk assessment as part of an applicant's permit application. Many projects have been required to provide these risk assessments in the last decade due to this policy. And the guidance lays out what practitioners could consider when conducting a risk assessment. and provides tools for carrying this task out. So these risk assessments are similar in scope to vulnerability assessments for sea level rise that folks on this call are probably very familiar with. They've occurred up and down California, often the jurisdiction scale or of varying scales, except that the difference with these risk assessments is that they are for individual project and parcel scale. So policy 3, kind of in tandem with that policy 2 about risk assessments, requires that when those risk assessments find that a project has flood risks that threaten public safety, the proponent has to demonstrate how the project is designed to be resilient to mid-century projections of sea level rise. This is where we're getting very specific. And if the project's lifespan is longer than mid-century, so 2050, an adaptive management plan may be required, looking at those potential for much higher values of sea level rise in the future. So this is using projections that at the moment are based on the OPC's sea level rise guidance update in 2018. And suggestions of what values to use for 2050 or 2100 depend on the project in question. If you're familiar with that document, the values are based on risk aversion, which is roughly translated to varying types of projects. So for example, under BCDC's policies, a project that's expected to have damaging flooding by 2070, but is expected to be in place until the end of the century, may be required to provide a plan for adaptation that would work to avoid the worst impacts of flooding for 2070 to keep it safe. Some projects may be required to provide these plans based on triggers or thresholds. Examples that we have in the guidance include the threshold of a certain level of observed sea level rise in the Bay Area, or a certain number of flood events on that particular site. So we use varying different approaches to these permit conditions. And some permits require landowners to provide an update to BCDC, for example, every 5 years. And the results from those reports could trigger those adaptation management plans to get moving, or require permit amendments based on what impacts each project is seeing. So this policy, again, this was 2011 that it was enacted. So it's an early adoption and incorporation of the concepts related to adaptation pathways, or the use of triggers and thresholds that may determine when a project needs to return to potentially a regulator and further assess options for adaptation. So dropping a lot more on the slide here, we'll go over the remaining 5 policies a little faster. The remaining 5 policies are more advisory. They influence the commission's work and staff's work, but are not used directly for writing special conditions within permits. So policy 4 encourages the special consideration for preservation and habitat enhancement for undeveloped parcels, especially those that are vulnerable to future flooding, and the idea being they could sustain habitat or species, or could be enhanced to do so. Policy 5 actively encourages the use of innovative adaptation approaches. For example, like there's the horizontal levee shown here, but the policies, taken all together, are not meant to hinder pilot or experimental projects that are attempting to find new ways to address sea level rise issues. So policy 5 was included to explicitly encourage those types of projects. Policy 6, this calls for a regional sea level rise adaptation strategy that would protect critical developed shoreline areas and natural ecosystems and enhance their resilience and adaptive capacity. So this policy lays out specific recommendations for what that strategy should include. Attendees today may be familiar with BayAdapt, which is another BCDC effort. It's convened by BCDC, but it is a recent effort to lay plans for regional adaptation in the Bay Area. BCDC convened this group and has remained sort of like the backbone agency for this sort of massive planning effort, in part to fulfill this policy 6. BayAdapt, as I mentioned, is kind of its own separate effort, but I would certainly encourage you all to look at that recently adopted resource as well. That's at bayadapt.org. So policy 7, basically case by case. So until policy 6 is fulfilled, policy 6 could include, some sort of like checklist or specific goals that a project could meet. But until policy 6 is fulfilled, projects should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis to determine the project's public benefits, to determine, that specific site's resilience to flooding and its capacity to adapt to climate impacts. So this policy also includes some like call-outs for specific types of projects that should be encouraged due to their massive public benefits. An example there being that ports may get an additional like support from policy 7. And finally, policy 8 basically calls for coordinating project reviews, especially when regarding sea level rise projects and flooding, with agencies that may have overlapping authority and jurisdiction. And that's in order to avoid conflicting guidelines, standards, or conditions. So now we'll discuss, the need for the guidance and what the development process looked like. So after 10 years of applying the policies, more or less, BCDC staff recognized that it was a good time to further communicate how these policies have been applied, introduce complex material on sea level rise and on climate change, and explain how recent updates to available science, such as OPC's guidance, would interact with BCDC's policies. And also just to help train BCDC's own staff on climate change analysis. So in the map here, you can kind of see some of the major permits that have been issued since the Climate Change Bay Plan Amendment, just offering a snapshot of how many projects have worked through this system over the last decade. So for an overview of the legal scope of this effort, it's meant to be a resource based on BCDC's working knowledge, and it's meant to help permit applicants more easily understand the requirements that have to do with climate change and with flooding. It will also be used, as I mentioned, by permitting staff when moving through these types of projects on the other end. So I think that's a useful thing in terms of transparency for both the permittee and the permit analyst to know. It also includes many examples of projects where the policies were previously applied, case studies, providing insight into what that process actually entails in practice. So it's not a source of new regulations in itself. The guidance document is not, nor does it really recommend any particular policy changes. It's written, meant to be kind of like a living document. And while there are examples included, many examples that we've included as case studies in this guidance, they're not necessarily meant to be all encompassing. If you have a project of a different type or different scope, that doesn't necessarily mean if you don't see it reflected in this guidance, BCDC would not be supportive of it. And finally, I'll just note that, due to the case-by-case basis of BCDC's work, it's not meant to be, a replacement for consultation with the actual permit analyst staff. Although it is, hopefully a very useful supplemental resource. So the process of putting this together has included lots of collaboration across, the various teams at BCDC. I'm, a member of the planning division within the art, like there's the art team within the planning division, and then there's also the whole regulatory side, which is, the bulk of the permitting program. And during the research and drafting phase, project staff started with a review of all those past permits, risk assessments, adaptive management plans. The planning staff also met with the regulatory and design teams to discuss how those teams actually interpret and implement the policies, including looking into what resources and tools those teams actually use for their own analyses. And staff also synthesized a review of the best available science that we have at the time and wrote it for a wide audience to be an introductory sort of content. And the regulatory staff also refined the case studies that the planning team had even further to provide examples that are expected to be most useful for actual project applicants looking to implement similar work. So once an initial draft was prepared, a committee of external experts was convened to review and to comment. This group is made up of representatives of various organizations that would likely interact with the final product. So feedback from the group was based on, the end user experience in order to make it more navigable, more useful. And they also provided feedback on the content to determine, what may still be missing from that draft. We also opened it up to public comment in March and April of this year. Once we got our comments in, staff went back to meet with all of our commenters, go over those comments or provide opportunities for further engagement, because many of them are our close, partners. And those comments ranged in scope, but in general, they were written again by, close partners of BCDC and allowed staff to go back and make sure the guidance is speaking to all sorts of projects and organizations that may work with BCDC. This included more focus on some smaller projects, clarifications on how certain policies are actually used in practice, and more discussion on things like, for example, public access and restoration projects. So now we'll go through an overview of the content here. As you can see, it's kind of broken out into these chapters: the introduction, the guidance itself on the policies, some example permit language is broken out into case studies. 4 and 5 are sort of technical guidance, selecting sea level rise projections as BCDC does, and looking at specific sea level rise impact assessments. And then finally, the appendices, which we'll touch on. So in the beginning of the introduction, there's the key takeaways. This is just a 2-pager. It's a summary, a basic summary of the policies. It's written to be clear and accessible. The idea here is to allow users to understand what they're looking at, what they're in for, before diving in. The full resource is about 120 pages, and so trying to be clear. This leads into the actual introduction, which includes the audience and goals of this guidance, an overview of BCDC's jurisdiction and authority in general, some background information on the Bay Plan climate change policies, and an overview of both BCDC's permitting program as it stands and the climate program efforts that have happened over the last decade. So the second part of this guidance is sort of the core content. This is the climate policy guidance, and it looks at how it's been used in permitting. So this section starts by going through each of those policies of the climate change section that we touched on, and it expands on when and how they're actually applied. This includes explaining key terms and phrases as they've been interpreted by BCDC staff, phrases pulled from the policies, describing tools and how to access them that are used by the permit analysts when assessing these types of projects, providing examples from past permitted projects, as I mentioned, noting specific information that permit analysts usually like to see included in an application that helps them analyze a project correctly. which hopefully limits, that sort of back and forth when applying for permits. And drawing connections when there are, certain policies that are often used side by side with other policies in the Bay Plan. So this section also includes information on related Bay Plan policies that aren't in the climate change section. We'll touch on those a little bit, as well as related Bay Plan policies that apply specifically to habitat projects. So I'm going to talk a little more here, a little bit about policies 2 and 3, just to take a minute to recognize the importance of how this report looks at these types of things. For anyone in the adaptation field, not many places where in one place you can sort of read this policy language, see discussion of how it has been used. We've really tried to stack it full of case studies with that legal language. And it's all, it's specific to sea level rise adaptation. So I have a couple examples following in the next couple slides that are in the guidance. And, they required resiliency and adaptability measures. So here are a couple examples permitted by the commission that were considered larger shoreline projects and required that, policy 2 and 3 risk assessment and adaptive management plan. So that includes Mission Rock. This is a mixed use development in the city of San Francisco. It was permitted in 2018. So the rendering here is included just to provide that sense of scope. We're talking about a large portion of the shoreline, and it shows that it's mixed use. It includes a lot of varying shoreline features. So, an in-depth parcel scale vulnerability assessment was needed. And I also included the other image of the risk assessment. I guess it's probably too small to read, but it is, included in the guidance as well, which just provides an idea of how these parcel scale projects look at varying flood scenarios. So another example here is Treasure Island or Yerba Buena Island redevelopment, which was permitted in 2016. Again, just sharing an example of the scope. This one's obviously bigger. This is an island in the bay. And also a portion of the risk assessment that was associated with that project. This one in particular is an interesting example that we've included because, as I mentioned earlier, this actually includes a requirement that the permittee provide BCDC with a flood report every 5 years from the issuance of the permit, including observed sea level rise for the bay and any updates to science that may affect the original design to this project. So now we'll just talk briefly about a few of the included policies that were updated in other sections of the Bay Plan through this amendment process, and some that are even more recent through the Fill for Habitat amendment and the Environmental Justice Amendment, which were both introduced and adopted in the last few years, so much more recent. So first, there's this shoreline protection policy number 1, which has much more text, but I've pulled out a couple that are clear and relevant to this topic. Well, basically, subheader C says you must consider sea level rise when designing shoreline protection for public safety reasons. And I know that sounds simple, but this is an example of how that original amendment made it so that climate adaptation policy language has made it into the Bay Plan throughout the document. It's not just reserved for the climate section. Also, subheader F there lays the groundwork for avoiding impacts to adjacent parcels or areas due to any new development, which, as we know on this call, is an emerging source for concern, particularly in the Bay, where protection projects can have inadvertent impacts to neighboring jurisdictions. So Shoreline Protection Policy 5, a little different. Projects must assess possibility of nature-based features on shoreline protection and use those to the greatest extent practicable. So this is a new policy that came with the Fill for Habitat Amendment. But I know this is relevant probably to many of the folks listening in. This is an exciting policy that is so new that we don't have many clear examples of its use in practice, but it is a clear connection, back to that policy 5, which encourages the use of innovative adaptation approaches and is a hopeful sign that the Bay will see more nature-based features on projects that include some type of shoreline protection, which could look like a lot of different things. There's Shoreline Protection Policy 8. This policy essentially says you must consider sea level rise science and emerging groundwater science in contamination remediation. This is another emerging topic of interest in the Bay and everywhere. That's groundwater rise and the possibility of emergent groundwater or mobilization of toxic substances through flooding of contaminated sites. This is a newer policy, but shows how BCDC can respond to emerging threats due to climate change. The threat of contamination is compounded by sea level rise, and these policies attempt to address that with project partners. So the safety of fills policies are paraphrased here because it's quite long, but here are some of the basics that were added to the policies. Basically, projects could be set back from the shoreline to avoid future impacts. Projects could be built to an elevation of the 100-year flood elevation plus future sea level rise that's relevant to the lifespan of that project. This one in particular is a very common design element to BCDC's projects. And also, projects could be designed to tolerate periodic flooding or other strategies that increase the resilience of the development itself to future flood events. So the public access policies in the Bay Plan were also updated, but one simple update was that public access should be designed and maintained to avoid significant adverse impacts from sea level rise and flooding. So in general, BCDC's public access policies require permanent dedication of public access before the climate amendment. And this now requires maintenance or equivalent access options if future sea level rise affects public access. So this was a common question that we heard, what happens with public access in the future? And keep in mind that each project is still assessed on that, case-by-case basis. But this guidance does include some examples of projects that were conditioned to consider that question in different ways. So there are some examples of projects in the guidance that have expected actually certain public access amenities to eventually flood. And while there's still the recognition that, equivalent access may be needed eventually, I think there are some interesting examples in the guidance of trying to grapple with that type of question. And so for habitat policies, reading from the Bay Plan here really quick, any habitat project should include clear and specific long-term and short-term biological and physical goals, success criteria, a monitoring program, and as appropriate, an adaptive management plan. So it goes on to provide what specific analysis should be done, including assessments of the adaptive capacity of the project, the impact of the project on the Bay's sediment transport, localized erosion, tidal flows, buffers between developments and habitats. And also here, subtidal areas policy 3 is very similar and requirements, but obviously for subtidal projects. So generally, project proponents may need to provide information regarding how a habitat project may be affected by sea level rise, consistent with the size and the impact of that project. So one example of a past habitat project approved by the commission, in which it was not a larger shoreline project, so it didn't have the requirements of policy 2. However, sea level rise was a key consideration, was the Thule Red Tidal Restoration Project in Sassoon Marsh. That example is included in our guidance, just can be considered as a case study there. So case studies, more case studies. Section 3 in the guidance is all example permit language from past permits. It's an entire chapter devoted to example special conditions that could be used as a basis for future projects of similar scope. We tried to include a whole breadth of project types in this section to offer ideas on how to write out resilience requirements. This section includes explicit language on adaptation, such as that trigger approach that we've talked about, to requiring permittees to plan for adaptation based on events such as observed flooding, observed sea level rise. We focus mostly on the largest projects that BCDC sees. We also included case studies and examples for smaller projects, for restoration projects, for public access projects, and for these sort of innovative projects such as living shorelines. These can all be found in section 3 as well, although the language for adaptation is often less explicit. The reason for this varies, but oftentimes, basically smaller projects, for example, have a limited lifespan. Maybe they don't have to plan all the way to the end of the century. And restoration projects have adaptability due to the inherent adaptability found in nature and in the use of nature as a shoreline protection. So the next section of the guidance contains summaries of the relevant best available science, technical information to support the implementation of the policies, as well as some lists of tools and additional resources for even further information. So it goes into a background information on the state of California sea level rise guidance, which BCDC uses in its programs and implementation, provides information regarding key components of the climate policies, explaining these terms that you see here, best available estimates of future sea level rise, the 100-year flood elevation. Those are included in policy 2 to be included in the risk assessment, so we want to describe them. This section ends with a summary of potential impacts of sea level rise, flooding, and the related hazards. This section 5, can be useful for any adaptation practitioner. I think looking for summaries of the risks of sea level rise and considering what impacts must be addressed in planning. So it's written as a primer, and the art team has many resources that go way more in depth, but staff wanted to provide an overview that would be provided to permittees alongside this guidance. So lastly, there's the appendices, which there is an introductory chapter on climate impacts, an introductory chapter on the art program and what it does, and also even more example adaptive plans. So Appendix A here is written to be accessible. Much of the information was pulled from the International Panel on Climate Change and the Rising Seas report, which were the basis of OPC's 2018 guidance. This brief chapter really provides a synthesis of that foundational science that must be considered when addressing sea level rise, and provides an overview of how the amount of sea level rise we see around the world and locally is directly tied to emissions and humans' ability to quickly draw down the use of fossil fuels. So there's introductions to the concepts of the greenhouse effect, emission scenarios, comparisons of the global and regional sea level rise, and more sea level rise mapping tools that are available to the public. The art program, which was incepted around the time of the climate amendment, has worked on vulnerability assessments around the Bay Area, partnering with local jurisdictions for multiple projects, and even putting together a Bay Area-wide report on the expected impacts of sea level rise, including an analysis of each operational landscape unit, OLU, which I know has come up on this network before, that's found within the Bay. And so those methods are published on the ART team's website. We'll provide a link to that for anyone interested to see how the ART team went about quantifying impacts to transportation networks, vulnerable communities, future growth areas, so like possible development areas and natural lands. And finally, the last appendix provides even more case studies. So we just selected 5 example adaptation plans that cover, a breadth of style and scope within that requirement. Some simply include the acknowledgement that adaptation may be necessary and will be decided by the progression of sea level rise, and that an adaptation plan in full may be required based on the special conditions, while others include more detail or even list, suggest or list adaptation options as sea level rise progresses. So I have talked a lot, but I, wanted to provide this type of overview of this new resource to show folks on the line that even if you are, outside of BCDC's jurisdiction, this new resource includes so much information about an early version of sea level rise adaptation policy that it can probably be at least of interest to practitioners in this field, particularly those who are looking at working on vulnerability assessments or have completed those assessments and are now considering implementation. What does implementation look like? And while these projects are all parcel scale, site specific, hopefully some of these case studies or policy language choices can help you and your organizations. So I'm gonna drink water now, and thank you for listening today, and let me know if there are any questions. I'm also planning on sharing these slides and links, therefore, once we finish up today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan, for giving that overview. And I know you put a lot of work into getting this guidance out the door, so thanks for that. We are going to transition to Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to use that Q&A function. We have a few here that will get started. And Dana is also now on the panelist line, so will be available for questions as well. So the first question is, does BCDC have a requirement or recommendation as to which OPC sea level rise projection scenario to assume when addressing future sea level rise? Yeah,
thanks. I'd say for that question, that's I'll direct you to chapter 4, where basically BCDC discusses the different projections that may be appropriate depending on the project type. And I know that answer of case by case is not ideal in some situations, but we work with such varying scope of projects that basically we need to leave room to say, what type of project is this? Obviously, something that's critical infrastructure should consider, higher risk aversion than something that maybe isn't. So in section 4, we talk about, what has been used in the past for each type of project. And again, happy to share, the case studies that we have of past projects and how they selected those are out there, and I think really useful if you're looking, if you have a similar type of project that's happened in the past. We can definitely help out if you want to reach out, and we can find what other projects have done in the past. But in the end, it comes down to consulting with the BCDC staff and figuring out, based on specific design considerations, what projection or more likely projections, considering a multitude of scenarios is appropriate for each project.
Awesome, thank you. Dana, do you have any additions to that? No, okay, awesome. So the next question is, does the Bay Plan climate change guidance policy and the BCDC permitting apply to Caltrans flood reduction projects, for example, with State Route 37, a preliminary project for segment A between Highway 101 and State Route 121 seems to create obstacles achieving long-term strategies in integrating environmental resilience and transportation improvements.
That's a good question. I wonder if, Dana, you have a thought on this. I know that BCDC staff are engaged with the broader, adaptation work going on with State Route 37, but in terms of do these particular policies apply, I'm actually not sure.
I don't think we can easily say a policy applies to a particular project at this time. It depends on, whether the project is within BCDC's jurisdiction. And then it's really up to a consult with BCDC permitting staff. So it's just not a question we can answer off the bat like that.
Awesome. Thank you. The next question, going back to that external advisory committee, it seemed to be more like state level agencies. Why wasn't local governments like cities and counties included in that external list?
Yeah, we worked originally, we just worked from what outreach we had available to us, but we certainly had local governments, local jurisdictions in mind because we often work so closely with them. So we had some folks who represented multiple groups. There were people who represented BayCan, which is a regional adaptation network that does represent quite a few jurisdictions and was able to provide feedback on their behalf. And then we also, BCDC itself is made up of a commission of quite a few local electeds, and we had lots of really great feedback from those commissioners at the time that we brought it to commission for an initial sort of public hearing. And so that was a place where we got really good feedback based on the local jurisdiction perspective.
And I would just add, if the climate change policy guidance didn't update or change the policies in any way, they just interpreted existing policies. So if there is a time when we do need to update policies in the future, we typically do have a robust engagement period and comment period associated with that.
Awesome. Thank you both for covering that. Are there any other questions? Again, feel free to use that Q&A function. And if not a lot of questions come through, then we'll end a little early and give 5 minutes back to everyone's day. All right, this is a thank you for the great overview, Dan. Can you briefly update us and describe how the fulfillment of Policy 6, the Regional Sea Level Rise Adaptation Strategy, is coming? I recall BCDC recently adopted the Bay DAP language. And Dana or Dan, if you want to cover that.
I think that's a great question for Dana.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So BayAdapt was released the joint platform was released approved by our BCDC commission in October. And that was the culmination of a 2-year consensus building process where we established 21 actions and tasks that will help to set the landscape for better and more equitable adaptation plans and projects in the region. But it doesn't get to specific projects or specific priorities along the shoreline. So that's actually our next step. And we have been working also with the state of California. There was a lot of legislative language in this past year about what regional plans would look like. So our next step that we'll be going through in 2022 is really adding specificity around the ideas laid out in BayAdapt, so that we actually do start establishing priorities that will inform the funding programs that are coming out of the state right now, and figuring out where we need to sort of target support for adaptation plans and projects. And that's what we're envisioning an adaptation, regional adaptation plan looking at the moment. But we haven't put any specificity around that. So if people are interested in being involved in that process, it will also be a highly collaborative process like the BayAdapt process has been so far. So if you want to throw your email address in the chat, we can add you to our mailing list and you can be updated on where we're going with that. But that will be a big push in 2022.
Thank you. And I disabled the chat for this webinar. So if you want to add to yourself to the mailing list, feel free to either put in the Q&A or you can email me later. I will send out a follow-up email that you can just respond to me for that.
Or you can email Dan. His email address is right here too.
Yeah.
Just get in touch with one of us and we'll add you to the mailing list.
Sounds great. Another question is, will BCDC's jurisdiction change with sea level rise?
Wow. I think I have no idea how to answer that question, but keep in mind that, BCDC's jurisdiction, while I'm able to show like a general map today along with our slides, BCDC's jurisdiction is also, very case by case, and project proponents will bring their parcel to BCDC for a jurisdictional determination. So, I don't think it's quite as simple to be able to just say, will jurisdictions change?
And this is something that our commission is very interested in. And we don't have a solid answer. We've never faced this in the history of BCDC. So again, it's one of the issues and ideas that was addressed in BayAdapt is how does BCDC adjust itself as the Bay shoreline changes? So again, stay tuned, be on our mailing list. We'll keep you updated on the thinking we're doing around that.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that. All right. Are there any more questions? And thank you for everyone that sent their emails in the Q&A. I have recorded those. Great. I can ask. All right, that may be all the questions. So I will start the thank you, and then usually one question comes up. But I just want to thank you, Dan and Dana, for taking time to present to the Coastal Resilience Network today. I really appreciate all the time and energy that you put into this guidance, and I see it as a really adaptable tool that a lot of folks can use, from the BCDC jurisdiction to California shoreline and beyond. So thank you very much for covering that today. And thank you all to the attendees that listened in today. I hope everyone learned something new and exciting. So again, slides and the recording of this will be available as soon as possible. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your week and take care.
Great. Thanks, Jen.
Awesome. Great job. Bye, everyone.